Before we start this Blue Sky episode, I want to tell you about a podcast that I think our fans will like. It's called The Breakout, and it's all about breaking the unwritten rules that we all live by without even knowing it. It's hosted by Dr. Carrie Ulrich and Kelly Gunther. As change experts, coaches, and talent specialists, they're fascinated by change, how to do it, and why we're often so scared of it. They speak to the bold souls who have busted out of life's boxes and built something all their own. From thriving but secretly unfulfilling careers, to paralyzing fears, to rigid societal expectations, these are the important stories of profound transformations and quiet shifts. For eye-opening stories and strategies for building your life on your own terms, check out The Breakout wherever you get your podcasts, because every change matters. From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Burke, and in every Blue Sky episode, we'll be speaking to leaders, researchers, and thinkers whose stories and insights will remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. On the Blue Sky Podcast, we like to speak with people who are taking on tough issues, in some cases, the very ones that make us pessimistic, and facing these challenges with an inspiring sense of optimism and possibility. Societal challenges around diversity, equity, and inclusion, dare I even say the abbreviation DEI, are a case in point. And today's guest fits our bill perfectly. Chloe Valdary is the founder of the Theory of Enchantment, a company that trains and coaches people and organizations using a unique, thoughtful, and compassionate framework for inclusion and belonging in the workplace and beyond. Chloe grew up in New Orleans, graduated from the University of New Orleans, and went on to become a Robert L. Bartley Fellow at the Wall Street Journal. In addition to the Journal, she has also written articles for the New York Times, the Atlantic Magazine, and today she writes her own newsletter on Substack. As you'll soon hear, Chloe Valdary is not afraid to dive headfirst into these tricky and sometimes controversial waters and offers some unique insights and ideas that will certainly make you think. I hope you enjoy this Blue Sky conversation with Chloe Valdary as much as I did. Chloe Valdary, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for having me.
Well, you've been very patient. As my listeners know, occasionally I run into some technological issues. I've never had more than trying to set this up with you, and I appreciate your patience. Without further ado, we're going to talk about your work at Theory of Enchantment, obviously. But first, I'd love for you to just tell us a little bit about yourself and why you think it is that you find yourself being so passionate about the work that you do today.
Sure. So I'm Chloe, and I am from New Orleans, and I live in New York City, and I love music, and I love dancing as well. And I grew up in a religious home.
Okay.
And although I'm not religious in the same sense, I do have a very deep love of spirituality and appreciation for spirituality. And I believe that we as a species are fascinating creatures.
I agree.
And I am passionate about the human condition and, living it and also wrestling with it. And I created a company to do that, essentially, and to help other people do that, to really navigate some of the, let's say, ups and downs, ebbs and flows of what it means to be human.
Yep.
So that's a little bit about me.
So why the name Theory of Enchantment? And then we'll talk about the principles.
So I created a company called Theory of Enchantment almost 6 years ago. And I always get this question. It's such a funny question. It's funny that I continue to get this question. So enchantment is a concept. You can think of it as an alternative, or just like something that's distinct from enlightenment.
Okay.
Right? So if you think about the West and the historical legacy of the Enlightenment, of the French Enlightenment,
Yes.
specifically, it came out of a religious cultural legacy. It came out of people who were wanting to, in many ways, challenge the theological institution of the day, the Roman Catholic Church, that claimed to have a monopoly on the truth. And a lot of these philosophers and scientists and figures were trying to pursue knowledge of their own volition, on their own accord.
Yep.
And they wanted to know how the universe worked, and they wanted to know how the cosmos worked. They were still very religious, right? It's not like many of them were not atheists. Many of them were deeply religious people.
Sure.
And they created a movement that produced really important, let's say, approaches, technologies that we have today. So like the scientific method is a technology that came out of the Enlightenment.
Yep.
At the same time, implicit in this pursuit of knowledge is a kind of fear of the unknown, right? And fear of not knowing, fear of not having knowledge. And this comes from a religious legacy in the West. If you think about Christianity and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the sort of story of eating the apple, right? So there's this grand sort of mythology in our culture, and by myth I don't mean false story, I just mean a grand narrative that animates us, right? So there's this grand mythology whereby we see ourselves, or we define ourselves as good if we have knowledge, if we are perceived as the knower, right?
Yep.
And so you have that in the Enlightenment, and knowledge becomes associated with the light, right? That's why it's called enlightenment. Yes. The light. If you have knowledge, you have the light, right? And you want to pursue the light, and you want to get away from the dark, right? Get away from darkness. And so light becomes associated with good and righteousness and all those things, and darkness becomes associated with evil and imperfection and corruptibility. And this is a problem
because I think I know where you're going.
Because light and dark are actually symbiotic elements of reality. The light and the dark depend upon each other in order to exist. And what ended up happening as a result of this sort of mindset is, in our pursuit of knowledge, we became really fearful of the dark, and we associated darkness with all those bad things. And we projected that concept of darkness onto the physically darker peoples of West Africa, called them inferior, and enslaved them. Mm-hmm. This is the psychology, the fear of the unknown, really is like the seed of supremacy, let's say.
Yep.
So enchantment is not about blinding light, right? Enchantment is about the integration of the light and the dark. I like to talk about the yin-yang symbol from Eastern wisdom traditions, which contains a balance, a harmony. There's always a little bit of light in the darkness. There's always a little bit of darkness in light. Wherever you're sitting right now, Bill, if you look around your room where you see shadow, you will also see light. It is baked into the fabric of reality itself. So the theory of enchantment is designed to help us integrate, come to harmony with our darkness and our light, our shadow and our light. And here I'm using those terms to simply mean the known. So I'm associating light with what is known or knowledge, right?
Right.
And the dark with what is unknown. There's no positive or negative connotation that I'm attaching to those. So that's a very kind of esoteric explanation of why enchantment.
I love it. Okay, so I pulled this from your materials. You have 3 principles at the Theory of Enchantment, and I really like them, and I'll just read them quickly, and then maybe we go through it and then talk about the kind of training that you do based on these principles. 3 principles: treat people like human beings, not political abstractions; criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down or destroy; and 3, root everything you do in love and compassion. Let's talk about treating people like human beings, not political abstractions. Can you put some meat on those bones, as they say?
I will do my best. So, one of the things that happens in the process or the experience of being human is, we're very complex creatures, and the most complex system in the known universe is actually the human brain. And the brain, scientists are still mapping out the brain, but the limbic system, scientists uh, guesstimate that it's, hundreds of millions of years old. And the limbic
Amazing.
system, and think about that. We're all walking around with that. That is us, right?
Yeah.
Like we are that.
Yeah.
So the limbic system is responsible for fight, flight, or freeze when we perceive something as a threat. So this evolved to help us, if we were walking through the jungle and we saw a tiger, this evolved to help us respond in a way that would ensure survival. And then we have the prefrontal cortex, which helps us slow things down. It's a lot younger though, and that matters, right? That means it's not as, it's not, we haven't had that part of ourselves for a while. So and it shows. Yeah. It's kind of a baby. So what often happens now in the modern world is we will perceive something that is unfamiliar as automatically a threat. So if we see something, and this usually especially happens when we are experiencing some sort of insecurity, right? So let's say I'm feeling like, let's say I have a political opinion about something, right? And I say the opinion and the group I'm a part of like ostracizes me and they throw me out of their group. And now I feel like I don't belong, right? So now I'm experiencing scarcity. And if I don't have the proper tools to cope with that scarcity, then I'm going to get defensive and I'm going to adopt an easy heuristic, an easy way of thinking to bring me back to homeostasis, essentially. And I'm going to I might think to myself, all the people who think like me are good and all the people who don't are bad, right?
Yep.
So what I've done there is I've turned all the people who don't share my opinion into a political abstraction.
Yes.
Right? I've labeled them with a broad brush.
Yes.
It's like a freezing mechanism, right? I've labeled them with a broad brush.
Yep.
And I've, accused them of simply being innately bad or inherently bad. Now, this is not what it actually means to be a human being. A human being is complex. A human being is constantly changing. A human being is constantly coming into being. That's what it means to be a being, right? If I label some other group of people with a very easy label, I am denying the fact of their humanness. I am denying the fact that they're constantly evolving, just like me, constantly changing, just like me, constantly coming into being, so on and so forth, just like me. So that's why treat people like human beings, not political abstractions. And this begins with a practice of treating yourself like a human being. What do I mean by this? When we stereotype others, we simultaneously stereotype ourselves. So if I'm able to recognize that in some contexts, I'm hardworking, and in other contexts, I'm lazy, right?
I hear you.
I will be less likely to project the stereotype of laziness onto an entire group of people.
Yep.
In order to defend my, sense of worthlessness or whatever.
Yes.
So I have to engage in a daily habit, in a daily practice of giving thanks for the full complexity of who I am, including the things that I don't like about myself, which can be a really strange thing to do. But if I engage in that practice of acceptance of the full complexity of who I am, if I treat myself like a human being, I will be much more likely to treat others in that same way.
It's interesting to hear Chloe's thoughts on the Enlightenment and the impact that the fear of the unknown has had on our evolving society. The way light came to equal good and dark evil goes a long way towards explaining historical bigotry against people with darker skin tones. And understanding this history can help us avoid stereotyping or treating people as what Chloe calls political abstractions. Chloe's now elaborated on the first of the Theory of Enchantment's 3 principles. Let's now get back to our conversation to hear more. We can go through the next 2, but I have a feeling it's going to come up in the answers to some of my next questions. So I'd like to talk about the training that you do, and I'll use the term DEI because it continues to get changed and criticized, and it's in and then it's out, and then it becomes, like you just described, a label, a quote unquote DEI hire. I'd love to know how you approach the training you do, what makes what you do different, and why do you take the approach that you do?
So a lot of approaches that started popping up after 2020, they basically objectify the human being, right? They turn the human being into an object. And they also argue that there's only one way you can be black, white, straight, gay, etc. They argue that if you're a person of color, you belong to the oppressed class. And if you are a white person, you belong to an oppressor class. They argue that the only defining binary in all of reality itself is oppressor versus oppressed. And they reduce human beings to those 2 categories, which is on a very basic level incredibly dehumanizing because it denies the complexity of what it means to be human.
Yes.
The infinite complexity of what it means to be human, right?
Yes.
And it actually creates a never-ending war of all against all, if you think about it.
Right.
It ensures that there will be this Manichean us versus them mindset. And in fact, in order to fight against racism, you must adopt an us versus them mindset. So it's very harmful, both to the individuals that have to sit through these workshops, as well as being harmful to all of society at large. It fosters divisions, it sows resentment, which is not only obviously bad for human relations, it's also bad for the workplace.
Yeah, right.
In general.
Right.
So my approach is, again, to invite people to explore what it means to be human. So I have a couple of different offerings that I do with companies, facilitations that I do with companies. I have workshops. I have a 90-minute virtual workshop, which goes through that first principle. What does it mean to treat people like human beings, not political abstractions? It's basically like we really sit with the question of what does it mean to be human, right?
Yeah.
What are all the things? What are some of the things that, like, if our needs are not met, can cause us to spiral and get into an us versus them mindset, right? It helps us to recognize that getting into an us versus them mindset is actually a coping mechanism to deal with pain. And then work through certain practices to get us out of that habit, because it's a habit, right? And then I also have a in-person full-day workshop, which goes through all 3 principles of the Theory of Enchantment. Again, more practices, more exercises, to really help people come to terms with what it means to be human. And then I have an online course for folks who want to do like more long-form, practice-oriented work. So those are some of the offerings, but the overall difference in terms of the ethos is that we don't dehumanize people. We celebrate what it means to be human. We celebrate the human condition, and we elevate it.
I imagine when you do that too, the more you focus on the human condition, the more you realize how much we all share, right? I mean, we all, whether with the color of our skin or our political affiliation or whether we grew up rich, poor, or in between, there's a whole lot that we share no matter what, as opposed to, you've described it as a lot of these trainings and the way DEI is applied is immediately self-segregating on these different regards. It sounds like you try to avoid that completely.
Yeah, so not only do we highlight what we have in common, by highlighting what we have in common, that is what actually makes us able to celebrate differences. Because one of the things I
Yeah.
say in one of the things I say in my workshop is we have this practice called the Who Am I practice, and it's a very simple practice. You put a timer on for 2 to 3 minutes, and you ask yourself the question, "Who am I?" And for every answer that comes to you, you say thank you. And the tricky, most difficult part about this is you have to include the things that you don't like about yourself and still say thank you. So people do that for 2 to 3 minutes. And then I say, if you were to do this practice from now until the end of time, you would never get to the bottom of who you are. Because that's what it means to be a human being.
Wow.
And what's so cool about that is that it highlights the fact that there will always be a mystery that exists within every single human. What I mean by that is like, I will never know exactly what it's like to be you, Bill, and you will never know exactly what it's like to be me. There's a beautiful mystery, right, that exists in every single one of us. This is the opposite of objectification, right? The reason why you cannot objectify a human being is because of that mystery. And being able to celebrate that mystery and see it within yourself and within the other actually makes you okay with difference instead of seeing difference as an inherent threat to your very existence.
Before we get back to our blue sky conversation, I want to tell you about a new promotional partner we have at the Optimism Institute. It's a terrific podcast series called Money for Couples. Hosted by Ramit Sethi, this show aims to help couples create a shared financial vision with clear steps for saving, spending, and living their best lives together. Each week, Money for Couples brings real, actionable advice with stories from real couples who face the same challenges you might be facing. For example, one episode you might want to check out is called We Save for Retirement but Have No Money to Spend Now. Money for Couples is available wherever you get your podcasts, so check it out and start building what Ramit Sethi calls your rich life today. Chloe Valdary expresses well her desire to move us all away from splitting the world between oppressor and oppressed, believing that we're all far too complex to fit into just two categories. Among her concerns is that this sets us up on a path towards a never-ending war of us versus them. Instead, she encourages us to realize that what it means to be human is, as she says, a beautiful mystery. To my ears, that kind of curiosity and constantly wanting to understand people and humanity better is a position of great optimism and could help all of us become better at accepting the differences we all have from one another. Chloe's also very clear about the dangers of living lives of separateness.
There's an interesting philosopher called René Girard, who's a French philosopher, and he said that conflict, actually, and especially violent conflict, starts to emerge often in many societies that are under this illusion of separation, but are in fact more alike than you would ever believe. And so, for example, like I have more in common with a white American from Virginia than I do with a black person in Nigeria, right? So, and yet, you can imagine a world. You probably don't even have to imagine. You can imagine a world in which the most minute differences between myself and this white person in Virginia gets so highlighted and elevated that it puts me under this illusion that we're so different when we are in fact so very much alike, especially as compared to other people around the world. So that's how I would That's how I would talk about that. illusion of illusion of separation.
No, it's fascinating, and you can even see in our society people getting tied in knots, as you talked about this desire and this knee jerk reaction to label, mixed race people, and it's like, are you black? Are you white? Are you Indian? Are you? And someone was telling me the other day, there's a show I don't watch, and I can't remember the name of it. I guess there's a scene where there's a character in the show who is of mixed race, as we define it, who quote unquote passes as white. And a black philanthropist comes to his school and says, I'm going to give free tuition to all the people of color in this school. And the people of color cheer. And this guy's like, wait a second, I'm half black or whatever. He's like, I want the money. And it just talks, I think the point is to try to point out some of the absurdity of these labels, not the absurdity of the philanthropic impulse, but the absurdity of these labels and how just silly they can get.
Yeah, they can get very well, the labels themselves are elusive, right? And this goes back to my point about the human being who's constantly becoming and constantly changing and constantly transforming. That's what it means to be a being, right? That's what it means to be alive, as opposed to an object. And I really think that so much of our problems stem from a fundamental misapprehension of the world, whereby we see each other as objects, and we don't really come to terms with or come into relationship with what it means to be alive, like fully alive. So yeah, there's a lot we could talk about there.
So in your work, I imagine there's sometimes you're called into an organization that feels like it's in some sort of crisis. There's a lot of tension at work, or there's been an incident, and then I imagine there also might be times where they feel like, well, things are okay, but this is really something we quote unquote should do, or it's checking a box in our ESG report or whatever it is. Can you talk about those different environments, and then I'd love to hear just some anecdotes or some thoughts on when your work has been incredibly successful, when maybe it's missed the mark a little bit, or because I imagine you must walk into some very different circumstances, some with a lot of heat and a lot of tension, some that and maybe some where people think everything's hunky dory, and then in the process of a day or a session, they realize, there are some things we need to work on. It's a very open-ended question, but I'd love to hear just kind of the types of environments you walk into and how things might be different when you leave.
Yeah, so I'll just start by saying, when I'm invited into an organization where the leadership at the top is not in sync with stakeholders, let's say, within the organization, and I'm talking about other employees, then there's going to be a limit to the impact that Theory of Enchantment can make in the organization. So I worked once with an organization where this was the case, where an individual in the organization came to me and asked me to essentially be his coach. And I worked with him as a coach for about a year. And the intent, at least partially, was to try and also influence the organization as a whole. But the leaders at the top weren't interested in that. They weren't interested in changing anything about the way they approached inclusion and belonging. And so there was just like I said, a limit to the impact. I impacted this individual, but I could not impact the organization. Unfortunately, this organization, if I were to predict what will happen to it, it will probably experience a great deal of, I think employees will be fatigued. A lot of the employees will experience fatigue. A lot of those employees will leave. After, at the very least, they will not put their all into their work.
Yep.
Because they feel resentment, and because they feel fatigue, and because they feel frustration and anger. And every time they vocalize their anger, they're told, you're being a member of the oppressor. You are the oppressor, and you don't. Not only are you the oppressor, you don't get to complain about anything, right?
Yeah.
So those types of organizations are limited in terms of what I can do and what the impact can be. On the other hand, I've worked with organizations where the leadership was on board, and in fact, the leadership prior to hiring me, hired another diversity and inclusion consultancy firm that wreaked havoc in the organization.
I've seen that.
I won't say that's actually a little bit dramatic. It's a bit over dramatic. I won't say wreaked havoc, but like they put forth certain beliefs and principles that were out of integrity with the organization's values and mission statement.
That's trouble.
And so after working with them for a year, they came to me, and I was able to train the managers in a multi-year partnership. And they were enrolled in the course, these managers, and they, as a part of this course, they had to buddy up with a colleague. And doing the course, it was like one lesson per week, and they had practices that they were actually putting into play every week. And whenever things would come up at work, so for example, this one manager, this customer started yelling at them because they had a need that wasn't being met.
Okay.
Because this manager was in our course, they immediately responded as they had been trained to respond, which is to say they didn't respond to the way the person was yelling at them. They responded by addressing the need. They pinpointed the need, and immediately the customer's guard went down.
Yep.
The tone of the interaction changed. And the manager was able to service that customer, and it actually ended up in a better relationship.
Interesting.
So those types of organizations are great, where like the leadership is on board and people are in lockstep. Caveat though.
Yes.
Caveat. So where I've missed the mark. This is a great question. I have missed the mark when I've worked with an organization where the leadership was on board, but the leadership did not have the buy-in of their own stakeholders. And it wasn't because there was some ideological difference. Actually, it was because their stakeholders, i.e. their employees, were overworked.
Oh, interesting.
And they already had too much on their plate.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And so you really have to be assessing the situation when you partner with an organization in a long-term way. And that's where I missed the mark, and I learned, and I'm very grateful for that learning.
Yep.
But you have to really have everyone on board, especially in an organization with multi-tiered staff. You want to have C-suite on board. You want to have their immediate, let's say, managers on board. And you want to have the people who are, let's say, in frontline workers, enough of them on board in order to move forward. Because otherwise there's going to be disconnect. And then talking about resentment, fatigue, all those other things that I mentioned earlier.
I'm really glad you just mentioned when things don't work out, because that would have been an easy question to dodge. And you just exhibited, I've been working on editing an episode with a guy who does leadership training. And he said the best leaders exemplify confidence and humility. And a lot of people think that those two can't go together, but you exude confidence with humility. And the fact that you just admitted when things don't go right shows why you're as accomplished a leader as you are.
Oh, thank you, Bill.
We all know that working on these challenging subjects around diversity, especially in the workplace, can be tough. And Chloe gives helpful examples of when her training works and when and why it doesn't. I was interested to hear her speak about those instances where these types of sessions would never get much traction simply because employees were being worked too hard and were so burned out that no new lessons were going to make much of an impact on them. And a bonus question for frequent Blue Sky listeners. Who was this guest I referred to who spoke to me about the best leaders combining confidence with humility? I'll give you a second. Okay, it was Lee Ellis, the former Vietnam POW turned leadership expert. That's Blue Sky episode number 71, if you'd like to check it out. And now, back to Blue Sky episode number 79 with Chloe Valdary. Here's a question I had as I was doing this research. When you come in and you talk about, you said this early in our conversation today, we have sometimes these categories like oppressor and oppressed. And you say, let's not use those terms. I can imagine a scenario where the oppressors in the room, traditionally labeled that way, would be like, oh, phew, I'm off the hook. And the oppressed group might say, who is she to tell me I'm not at prey, right? I would think it could create a really interesting dynamic when you kick off a session. Can you talk about that?
So I never say that at the beginning of a session.
Okay, good. Smart. Okay.
I say it after, if I do say it at all, right? I
Yeah.
say it because
Yeah.
I don't need to explicitly say it.
Right.
But if
You're
I
too
if
smart for
I
that.
well, it's just not, it's just not necessary all the time. But if I do say it, then it's after I have sufficiently revealed to everyone in the workshop the grandiosity and also the smallness simultaneously of what it means to be human. So I've already put them through this experience, through this
Yeah.
nearly 90-minute experience at this point in the workshop.
Yep.
And I actually talked to them about a person of color who responded to a white nationalist in a way that was very enchanted, let's say.
Interesting.
Um,
Okay.
and enchanting. And there's tons of stories like this. There's, I don't know if you know Daryl Davis, who famously he's a black man who befriends members of the KKK. Like there are
Yes.
famous people
Yes.
who do this, right?
Yes.
There are people
Yes.
who do this as a like a lifestyle.
All right.
and and at this point in the workshop, I've really broken down what it means to be human, what happens when our needs are not met and we don't have the coping mechanisms to deal with those unmet needs. Sometimes we default to these easy black or white binaries, right? And the most excessive form of this is racism, right? But we basically, as human beings, this is what we do. When we experience pain and insecurity and we don't know how to deal with that pain, we project it out onto the other as a
Sure.
way to cope, right?
Yep.
This is true for every human being. And so I've sufficiently walked them through this. I've explained the psychology of this. I've given
Yep.
them many examples of this. And then I actually present them with a different binary, which is not the binary of oppressor versus oppressed, but it's actually the binary of someone who's integrated, right? Someone who's actually in right relationship with their shadow and their light
Yep.
versus someone who's not. And
Fascinating.
that's a new binary that now you can
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah.
It's a new framework that you can understand these dynamics through.
Fascinating. Okay, so here's a question. We were introduced, you probably wouldn't remember this, or you might, a woman named Virginia Gleason, who was a Blue Sky alum. She was on my podcast, and she does a lot of work in law enforcement. And you mentioned 2020 when a lot of this work was becoming more popular. That was the summer, in addition to the COVID pandemic, the summer of George Floyd. And so I assume you've done work with Virginia. So I'd love to hear you talk about a dynamic like that where you have police force. So you have issues presumably within the force between people who work together in the force. And then obviously you have issues with the force and how they're perceived and how they act in their community. That to me has about every complex dynamic you could come up with. If I'm right that you've done that sort of training, is there a different dynamic there, or talk about that?
So the only training I've done limited training with police officers. I've done full day workshops with police officers, but I've never done the kind of multi-year program that would be required to produce the kind of change that you're talking about. But I could tell you what I would
Okay.
do if I had been given that if I am given that
Please.
opportunity. Right?
Yeah.
So it would entail the workshops that I discussed. It would probably entail an assessment of the systems that, let's say, police officers in a given county are working according to. One of the things that I can tell you, some of the barriers that wouldn't make Theory of Enchantment work. If a and this is ironic, right? This is related to the whole conversation around defund the police. If a police county is severely underfunded, then there's a huge chance that there will be an incentive for-profit policing in that county, which means that police officers will be incentivized to issue, an excess amount of tickets, make an excessive amount of stops.
Yep. And
In
make their
order
number.
to basically get paid a wage.
Yeah, right.
A living wage, right? In the event that I am asked to work with a county or a police county that is affected by that, I probably would say no, because the systems in place are not set up for what I'm teaching to actually take root. However, if I'm asked to work in a county that has resources, then there would be then I would feel that there's some room to actually make change. The thing about making a change is that it does come with pain and suffering. Like to move from one mindset to a new mindset, it comes with pain and suffering. So there has to be enough resources. There has to be enough, just resources, and not just monetary resources, but like some sort of community engagement that exists between police officers and the community they're policing. There have to be some mechanisms in place that I could see that would tell me that as this change takes place, even though there's pain and suffering, there will be enough resources to midwife this process into being. And I would welcome that. I think that's a really exciting opportunity, but I haven't worked in a multi-year, partnership with any police county or unit or anything like that. And I would be fascinated to do that, and it would make for a very cool, longitudinal study of some sort. So,
well, we'll put out an all points bulletin, if you'll pardon the the use of that word, and talk about the police, but your services are available. Chloe describes here some conditions that often trigger racism. She says that when we experience pain and insecurity, we project these problems onto others as a way to cope. As she helps the people she trains to understand this better, they learn new frameworks to use to help them relate more effectively and fairly to people who don't look like them. Now, back to the final segment of this Blue Sky conversation with Chloe Valdary. So a question. Yeah. So I am talking to you from the studios of the Optimism Institute, and you are working on work that can be really challenging, really divisive. It is, triggering for people, you name it. How do you come at it with such a sense of optimism? And as you've been at this for several years now, are you more or less the same optimistic about your ability and society's ability to make impactful change in these tough areas that you're trying to address?
Oh,
big question.
Am I optimistic? What does that word mean to you, Bill, actually?
To me, it means, here's my handy definition. I think an optimist believes that tomorrow will be better than today and that they have a role in making it so. So in your case, that tomorrow, or let's say next year, next 10 years, in your lifetime, things will get better and that you're playing a role in making it so.
I believe that the what's the saying from Dr. King? The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I also think in terms of like 100-year plans.
Yes.
So who knows if it'll happen in my lifetime, to be honest.
Okay.
I think that I know we've come a very long way as a species.
Yes.
And I think that's a testament to that arc. But I don't know. This is a hard sort of like framework for me to make sense of or to digest, because what we're talking about at the end of the day is a really daunting challenge. And the daunting challenge is that we as human beings find it very scary to engage in the practice of really getting to know ourselves and really getting to sit with ourselves and taking stock of our mortal frames and being grateful as a
Yeah.
result. It's a
Yeah.
really scary thing to do. Um, and so I'm happy uh, to play my tune and contribute to the harmonies,
Yes.
the harmonies, um, and do so with all humility. I have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow or next year. I understand that we as human beings are often very fickle creatures, myself included.
Yeah.
So I have no idea, but I am very optimistic, and I very much believe that if more people engage in the practice of giving thanks, which is really what the theory of enchantment is in its heart and soul, it's a gratitude practice. At the end of the day, giving thanks for the fullness of this thing we call life, with all of
Yep.
its ups and downs and all of its shadow and lights. If more people did that, then I am pretty confident that we could solve a lot of the challenges that we have, and we could create more inclusive societies in general.
And I would think you have to have some of that belief for what makes you get out of bed in the morning and do this work, which isn't easy.
Oh,
And
definitely, yeah.
I'm so glad you talked about gratitude. It's a big part of what I try to talk about, and it's one of the Stoics. I think I can't remember which one you might know, who said gratitude might not be the most important virtue, but it's the parent of all the others, or something like that. That you start. I'll look it up, and it's much more articulate than the way I just said it. But it is so important, and it's one of the reasons I try to do this work is that I think that you talked about how much we've improved as a species. In so many ways, our daily lives have improved as a society, and we don't take time to appreciate that. And if you don't appreciate it, then you're just constantly thinking things are terrible, things are terrible. You say, well, wait a second. Yeah, they're not great, but they're better than they were 50 years ago on this metric or whatever it is. I interviewed a gentleman named Kevin Kelly, and I use this quote almost every episode, but he said, if you only read the news, you'll think things have never been worse. But if you read history, you realize things have never been better. And I think it's important to pause and do that every once in a while. But one of the reasons things get better is because people like you roll up their sleeves and dive into this difficult work. So what's next for you for Theory of Enchantment? Where are you taking all of this? And paint a picture for us. If we were talking 5 years from now, what would Chloe Valdary's life look like? That's another big one.
Hopefully, I'll be married in 5 years. That would be cool. I think I would welcome that.
Okay.
So that'd be nice. Maybe a child on the way. Um, but for Theory of Enchantment, I want to start bringing more embodied workshops into the offerings that I have. I'm very musical, deeply musical, so I'm
Okay.
going to start building experiences that show people how they can use music actually to get in harmony
Yes.
with the full complexity of who they are, to be themselves fully, right? Because a lot of the times when we talk about music and wanting to perform music, we get nervous, we don't like the way our voice sounds, or so this all is all connected to the ability to be vulnerable with each other, open and honest and transparent with each other. So I'm going to be building some musical experiences into our offerings.
Great.
And I'm excited to open up new partnerships as well. I've had the benefit of meeting a lot of cool people this year who have come into Theory of Enchantment orbit, who work at various different organizations, who want to partner in some way, shape, or form. So I'm excited for those to expand. And yeah, just continuing with the practices and continuing to teach the practices, and hopefully expanding the reach of the practices as well.
Well, I'm hopeful that this time with me will help you expand your reach. You're a really unusual, really interesting, thought-provoking person, and I think the work you're doing is extremely important. And the sense of optimism whether you realize it or not, that you exude when you talk about it is significant. And so I know how busy you are. You've been very patient with me and my technological shortcomings. I really appreciate you spending time to do this show. And I look forward to staying in touch and tracking your progress because you're going to do great things.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate you.
It was a great pleasure. Thanks. As we move towards the end of our conversation, Chloe acknowledged that we've come a long way as a species, and that Martin Luther King Jr. was right when he said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. She also talked about the importance of gratitude, and the person I was trying to remember was, of course, Cicero. And I loved hearing Chloe talk about her ideas for the future and possibly even branching into music. Another trait of an optimistic outlook, a lack of fear of trying something new. I know I'll look forward to following Chloe's work and any new areas she pursues down the road. I hope you enjoyed this blue sky conversation with Chloe Valdary. Before you go, please leave us a rating or review. These not only help us do our jobs better, they also help other podcast fans find their way to our show. And if you like this content, follow the Optimism Institute on social media and subscribe to our monthly Blue Sky Weekend newsletter. This and all Blue Sky episodes are made possible by the great team at Sound On Studios, who week in and week out do a great job with our editing and mixing. And all cover art and design for Blue Sky and the Optimism Institute are produced by Crush Graphics. For more information on these two great partners of ours, check out soundonstudios.com and crushgraphics.com. And that's Crush with a K. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke, and I thank you for listening.